Well, I think, one of the things that you sort of pointed to when you were talking about it, when you listen to, there's a lot of great true crime podcasts out there, and there's, a lot of great podcasts from all sorts of different perspectives. But one thing that I think you never really heard was a perspective that we have. I mean, from the position of a prosecutor, there are a lot of sort of very defense friendly podcasts, but oftentimes prosecutors, and it's part of it is just the nature of the job. Part of it is the rules a lot of prosecutors work under. We're not really good at talking in the press. That's not what we do. Defense attorneys, it's part of their entire thing, engaging with the press and sort of getting their side out there. And I love true crime, and you'd listen to true crime and you would hear that perspective, and it's an important perspective, but you were only hearing one side. And I just always thought that there was this huge opportunity out there to fill a void.
That's Brett Talley, an attorney and the co-host of the Prosecutors and the Legal Briefs podcast.
Think can help people understand where our viewpoints come from. And also, here's the thing, the human experience can be incredibly lonely until you realize that there are so many more commonalities and there are things that divide us, right? I mean, Brett and I, just looking at us on the outside and knowing our backgrounds, we probably couldn't be two more different people. He is like my best friend. And if we chose to only put ourselves into, boxes that divided us, then we would miss out on a beautiful friendship, a beautiful work relationship, and like this amazing podcast experience that, is truly been a highlight for both of us in our lives. And so I think there's nothing that you really can lose by being vulnerable. I have learned that even in the courtroom. A lot of people think that by hiding your vulnerability, you show strength, but I think it's the opposite. By showing vulnerability, you are choosing to take the first step to extend out and to reach out into the void and say like, hey, life is hard. Let's go through this together.
That's LaCour, also an attorney and Brett's co-host on the Prosecutors and the Legal Briefs. Brett and Alice started the highly rated Prosecutors podcast back in May of 2020, only a few months after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Brett grew up near Birmingham, Alabama, made his way to the University of Alabama, where he studied philosophy and history before going to and graduating from Harvard Law School. Brett started his career as a clerk in the Department of Justice and worked as a clerk for a federal judge before going into private practice and working as a writer on a political campaign before returning to government and working as a speechwriter for Ohio Senator Rob Portman. Following that, Brett took various legal positions with the state of Alabama and the Department of Justice. Brett is a natural storyteller, and he's the author of a nonfiction book on the paranormal history of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, several novels, and has contributed to several collections. One of his novels, That Which Should Not Be, was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award, the annual award for the top horror novels. Alice grew up in Austin, Texas, the daughter of immigrants, and attended Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, where she studied economics before attending Yale Law School. Alice began her career as a federal law clerk on the district and the appellate court levels, before holding various positions as a trial attorney, as an advisor to senior Justice Department officials, and the criminal chief in a U.S. Attorney's Office. Alice is now a partner at a major law firm. Alice and Brett have both been involved in civil, criminal, and appellate litigation and bring a unique perspective to the true crime space, both in terms of seeing cases through the eyes of lawyers and as prosecutors. After years of talking about doing a podcast, The Prosecutors was born of Alice stopping sleeping after having a baby and finally having the time to start recording. They started The Prosecutors on their own, and it's grown into one of the top true crime podcasts in a short amount of time. In May of 2020, they started their second podcast, Legal Briefs, which explores the law and more current cases. Today, we're going to talk about the real life of being a prosecutor and an attorney, the role that the legal system and the rule of law play in upholding democracy, the myths and misconceptions around those roles, and about crime and the role that prosecutors play. Brett and Alice, I just wanted to thank you for joining to have this conversation with me and our listeners. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how I first came across your podcast. It was I wasn't much of a podcast listener, period. And during the COVID pandemic, how a lot of people started working on their decks or getting dogs. I started walks, and I would walk and walk, and that kind of threw off my anxiety. And I needed something to do. So I started listening to podcasts related to COVID and other topics. And I tripped across the Murder Sheet podcast and listened to some of their coverage of, the Delphi murders with the young girls who were on the trail on the bridge. And I came across you guys on an episode that you did, the Murder Sheet. And it was really amazing for me because rarely, as a reporter, I got a chance when I was a reporter to talk to the chief assistant district attorney because they wanted to sort of push down a political message, or I spoke to the spokesman or someone else, but rarely did I ever get to hear from the line appellate attorneys or the line prosecutors. And I just found your podcast and the discussions that you guys had to be thoughtful, yet fun, respectful of people. And you did a great job of explaining the way things work. So I grabbed the podcast. I listened to a couple episodes on Delphi. And then I tripped across this great episode, which we can talk about Dyatlov Pass and in Russia, listened to all of those episodes. And then I think I just downloaded everything I possibly could. But what I think the thing that I found so powerful, your partnership, but also your ability to simplify things for people, to be really thoughtful, to bring logic to bear. And the fact that, one of the core pieces of it, I think you guys really understand people and are able to explain people and explain their from lots of different perspectives, from a compassionate approach. So I was hooked, and I've become a giant advocate for your podcast. So I am, as you can imagine, I am just thrilled to be able to have you guys on.
Well, thank you so much for all those kind words. We need to come on more often so you can.
I was going to say, I'm not going to talk on this episode because I could just listen to you all day.
I could become your new spokesman, maybe.
There you go. Absolutely. Jayson, thank you so much. Everything you said, it's been such a great community, and Brett and I are just friends. Truly, we are friends first, and this project was a fun event for us to be able to hang out as friends. And the fact that people listen, and people like you who, we respect a lot, listen and like it, is just beyond our wildest dreams.
Yeah. I was going to ask you guys, what was it that originally inspired you to do a podcast?
Well, I think, one of the things that you sort of pointed to when you were talking about it, when you listen to, there's a lot of great true crime podcasts out there, and there's, a lot of great podcasts from all sorts of different perspectives. But one thing that I think you never really heard was a perspective that we have. I mean, from the position of a prosecutor. There are a lot of sort of very defense-friendly podcasts, but oftentimes prosecutors, and it's part of it is just the nature of the job. Part of it is the rules a lot of prosecutors work under. We're not really good at talking in the press. That's not what we do. Defense attorneys, it's part of their entire thing, engaging with the press and sort of getting their side out there. And I love true crime, and you'd listen to true crime and you would hear that perspective, and it's an important perspective, but you were only hearing one side. And I just always thought that there was this huge opportunity out there to fill a void. There aren't that many voids in true crime. There are a whole lot of true crime podcasts, but this was a void. And basically, I badgered Alice until she finally agreed to do it.
And that's completely accurate.
And Alice, go on.
No, go ahead, Jayson.
I was going to say, I mentioned in the intro that it was because you couldn't sleep because you had a child, but what really attracted you to this?
I really couldn't sleep. No. So Brett and I have worked several jobs together, and, we were prosecuting together, shared a wall at the office, and spent all of our time talking about our cases. If you find a work friend like that who you can really have these amazing intellectual debates with about your work, I mean, it's so incredibly fulfilling. Still one of the best work relationships I could ever imagine. And naturally, because we're, curious about all sorts of things, we would also talk about cases that we weren't prosecuting that was out in the news, except Brett and I would just talk about them, and he was like, we should talk about this and record it. And I was like, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't want to hear my voice ever. And he really asked me, I don't know, Brett, more than a year, right? It was quite a long time. And I thought he was joking. And I said, no. And I'm so glad that in my sleep deprivation does have to do with it, with a newborn. I said yes, because I just thought, why not? What could be more busy than this time in my life? And I'm so glad that I did say yes.
Oh, that's awesome. Are you guys at all surprised by some of the reaction that you've gotten to it? I know when I was listening to some of your episodes, where you on the anniversary of the podcast, where you talk about how you didn't expect a lot of listeners, but you flew to the top of the true crime charts, which is highly competitive space to be in. Were you guys surprised by that? Did you sort of think you would be talking to yourself, your family, and a handful of colleagues, or did you kind of know that it would take off?
Well, it's kind of funny. When we first started doing it, we didn't tell anybody that we knew. So we actually had no expectation that we would be talking to our colleagues or our family. We just we decided basically we're going to do this. We had to jump through some hoops to get permission to do it, because as I said, being prosecutors, it's not what you normally do. And it was sort of a weird thing. People looked at us funny when we said, hey, we would like to do this. Can we get permission to do this? And we initially sort of just went into it with look, we're going to basically not going to tell anybody else that we know. We got permission from our bosses. We'll just keep it low key. And if nobody listens, we can just stop doing it, delete everything, and nobody will ever know we did it. Right.
You won't have to worry.
Right. And we didn't do any advertising. We do anything. We basically just started recording episodes and kind of went from there. And I think it was just one of those things where, like I said, there was that gap, and we were fortunate enough to be the ones who filled it. And I think that had a huge effect, because people were hearing something they'd never heard before. They were hearing something different. And it was very much a word of mouth, and still is very much a word of mouth thing, just people telling their friends to listen to it. And I knew that we would get, and we saw some of this in the beginning, there was some initial, why would we want to hear prosecutors? Prosecutors are all evil, terrible people, because a lot of people who listen to true crime, they've listened to so many sort of, unjust convictions, wrongful convictions, that they really do have this conception of prosecutors just want to win. They just want to put people in prison. They don't care whether they're guilty or not. They don't care whether or not the victim's actually getting justice. That's just what they want to do. And that was another thing we wanted to push back on. And we've attempted to do that just by sort of explaining the way things work. Not, we're not trying to be, spokespeople for how great the prosecutors of the world are, but just sort of, hey, look, this is how the system works. This is what we do. This is what we look at. Those decisions that you think are unusual, here's everything that went into that. You've never heard that before. Why'd they do that? Why'd they do this? And I would like to think that was something people appreciated and they wanted to hear more of. And that was one of the reasons that people did respond so positively to the show so quickly.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that point, but just thinking about my experience, that most of what I've learned about prosecutors has been outside looking in, right? Not really the prosecutor's perspective, but kind of having to surmise, right? Because prosecutors don't get rewarded for talking to everyone. having to surmise what their motivations or their reasons are. But I remember my brother's also, he's a corporate attorney, but he once made a really good point to me while he was in, I think it was while he was in law school. He said, Jayson, you have to remember that the prosecutors also have an obligation toward justice that goes beyond convicting the person. You know, they're in a position where they have the responsibility, yes, to prosecute cases, but the real responsibility is toward justice. And I thought it was really kind of an interesting perspective, you know, coming from someone who's used to thinking of the defense attorney as the one who is there to sort of defend the Constitution and the rights of people, but the prosecutors also, am I right, play a role in that?
Yeah, absolutely, Jayson. That's a great point. That, a lot of what prosecutors do will never see the day of light of day, will never see the light
Either.
of day. And that's because, we have the duty to not only bring cases that we think rise to the level of reasonable doubt, but we also have to not prosecute cases that do not reach that level. And many investigations lead to just that outcome, but you do not make those public. You cannot make those public. And those are absolutely the two things that we have to hold simultaneously. It just happens that cases only become public once charges are brought. And so you only see kind of the one side. But at the exact same time that we're investigating cases, many cases, we may even bring to the grand jury and have investigations happen and decide, we will not bring these charges because we don't have the requisite burden of proof to be able to bring it. And that is something that, again, the public doesn't see. And so by being able to talk about it, I think people saw it for the first time. And we were able to, again, talk about cases detached, because we don't talk about cases that we work on. We can't do that. And by kind of giving a view into what other prosecutors are thinking about, what factors they're considering, is, I think, good for the entire judiciary, right? The entire justice system,
Yep.
because we are all part of that justice system. We've said that time and time again. The Constitution envisions for criminal charges that you have a right to a jury trial, jury of your peers. And because of that, every single one of us here in America, where we practice, does have a role to play in the justice system, whether or not you are sitting in that specific jury pool, because at some point you are the pool from which we draw on. And so what Brett and I have always thought of is, there's so much misinformation out there, not necessarily because it comes from a place of malice, but because there's no one else educating from kind of our perspective. And if we can kind of help educate something that all of us should know, it's like basic civics lessons. I think our justice system and our society writ large is better for it if we can all think independently. We really don't come in with a perspective, right? We've always said this to our fans. Disagree with us. We love that. We love good, respectful debate. That is what we do for a living. We don't care if you disagree with us, but tell us the reasons why you disagree with us. If we can teach you to think critically, then awesome. And here's the thing. You probably already know how to think critically, but a lot of the news consumption, social media consumption, the way it's channeled these days actually tells you to just follow the group as opposed to think critically about why you believe what you believe.
That makes a lot of sense. It's something I was just thinking about what you were saying there, and I want to make a confession. I don't think I've ever said this to you guys, but I've said it to other people about you, and this sort of ties to the point that you were making about educating people about prosecutors. But I used to say to people, and I was dead serious, I can never be on a criminal trial jury, and I said that the reason why I can't be on a criminal trial jury is because I've seen so many bad prosecutors. And two things I really learned in your podcast: A, there are good prosecutors, right? They're good people. But so much of what I, as somebody who is educated about the law and the criminal justice system, so much of what I saw from the outside was clearly misconceptions. So I'm back in the jury pool because of you guys. So.
Wow. That's actually, whoa, that's huge.
Yes. Well, and I think it's to your point, right? And I don't think it's just my experience as a reporter, but what gets covered is, in the news, what gets covered, dog bites man doesn't get covered. Bites dog. So we pay attention to the cases where something has gone terribly wrong. We pay attention, and I think you guys would probably agree, there are some cases where clearly people are innocent or there have been problematic prosecutions. And I know you guys have done a couple episodes on that, or even episodes where there were convictions and you had problems with the way the prosecutors handled things. So I think, to your point, Alice, we don't really get exposed to the positive just by the way our media and our social media and all those other things work.
And I think one of the problems, I mean, there's a lot of problems. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. Part of it is sort of the plane crash problem, right? I mean, everybody remembers the plane crashes. They don't remember that plane travel is the safest form of travel, right? Because when things go horribly wrong, they go horribly wrong, and that's what you're going to focus on, and that's what you're going to remember. The other problem is it is such a complex thing, and in I don't know if maybe it's always been this way, but certainly in our society today, sort of the bite-sized narratives of today, we want everything to be simple. We want everything to be simple and black and white and to fit neatly into sort of our socio-political views, right? I mean, that's the way we want it to be. And the justice system in particular is so incredibly complex, and it is entirely, I mean, most things are like this, but the justice system in a way that is just so, it is so purely human driven. Everything about it is people. And so prosecutors, there are bad prosecutors because there are some people who are in those jobs who shouldn't be in them. The problem is, people want to talk about how to fix that and how the system is broken when the system is not really broken. It's just whatever system you create, as long as it's made up of people, there are going to be places where it breaks down. And I think there's an example of this that just happened. So we hear people say all the time, it's too hard to undo a conviction and it's too easy to convict innocent people. And, better 100 guilty men go free than one innocent man spend any time in prison. And then you have the illicit attorney case, right? You have the illicit attorney case where everybody's emotions are, we need to convict this guy, right? And it goes through the process and the judge enters a judgment of acquittal, which is a rare thing. But if the prosecution doesn't meet its burden under the Constitution, that is what they are required to do. And everybody's up in arms. And we get all these tweets. What can be done? Can he ever be tried again? What if they find more evidence? Can they prosecute him on something else? And I'm explaining why that can't be. And I'm also thinking in the back of my head, this is why this is so difficult. Because on the one hand, you're wanting to tear down the system and rebuild it in a way to ensure that innocent people don't go to prison. But on the other hand, you're outraged that the justice system, unfortunately, if you believe he's guilty, worked exactly the way it was supposed to protect the rights of the accused and acquitted this person. And there is no easy black and white answer to many of the problems that we have in the justice system because they are so deeply human.
Yeah, no. I mean, by the very nature of the way that, we have juries, be the triers of fact and judges, law, all of it is subjective, right? You try to create objective outlines. It's subjective, and they're bad actors or wrong actors in the mix. And just that case that you were talking about, the illicit attorney case, that was her father, Michael Turney, was stepfather, right? Was accused of killing her, but she just disappeared, right? Disappeared in Arizona. Correct. Yeah. And he was the last person to see her. My impression was the prosecution did a good job of proving he was a bad human being, but obviously the judge didn't feel he met the burden. And it is kind of interesting to watch the social media reaction, that it's often the same people who are yelling very loudly about innocent people in prison are also at the same time yelling about him being acquitted by the judge. So, I know that there's some crossover and probably separate camps, but it really sort of makes me wonder, is the job of sometimes being in the chair of a prosecutor a thankless job, like he can't win with the public?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, look, most prosecutors go to work every day and do their job. Nobody even notices, It's rare that you have an Alex Murdaugh case, right? and,
Right.
and you saw how that went. I mean,
Thank
those
God.
prosecutors, yeah, exactly. Those prosecutors were getting raked over the coals every day. Alice and I are defending them because we thought they were doing a good job. They then win, and then they're the greatest thing in the world, right?
Yep.
so it's like a lot of things. The outcome really matters to a lot of people. But look, I will say this. I don't think it's a thankless job because there are many times where, number one, when you have victims and you get justice for those people, or they get to tell their story for the first time on the stand, or someone believed them, I mean, there's not going to be big trumpeting headlines about that, but that's fine. That's not why we do it. And I will tell you, there are times where we are able to see somebody's life turned around. I realize people find this, to be difficult to believe, but one of the purposes of incarceration is rehabilitation. And, I have seen cases and been involved in cases where people got really long sentences, served half of them, had obviously become sort of pillars of their community in their prison, turned their lives around, and I was able to work out something where they didn't have to serve the rest of that time. They were able to leave and start a new life. And one of the guys I'm thinking about, he now owns a business and he hires ex-convicts, and he's a pillar of his now out of prison community. And I think he would tell you that when he was put in prison, the path that he was on was one that was going to end up, he was going to either be dead or at some point would get a prison sentence that he would never get out of. And if you looked at his history, I mean, going all the way back to when he was 13 years old, he was involved in violence and all sorts of stuff. And that is really, I mean, you talk about something that sort of, as I think I even said in the courtroom, it's rare that everybody's on the same side. Everybody's rooting for the same thing to happen. And I think it is thankless if what you're looking for is praise from the outside. But I think day to day, it is really one of the most fulfilling jobs you can have. And there's bad days. Don't get me wrong. There are. But I think that's true probably of anything anybody does.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Thankless is if you're looking for outside praise, you're not going to get that basically as an attorney. It doesn't matter if you're on defense or prosecution. But one of the great things about being a prosecutor is that it's an incredibly human job, right? You are constantly talking to people whose lives have been utterly upended. If you are a witness or a target, or if you have anything that touches a criminal case, it is probably the largest deal in your life at that time, right? I've never lost sight of that. It is good, bad, whatever you want to call it. It is probably all consuming. If it is your son who is on trial, if you are a victim, if you are just a witness to something horrendous, at least I really never lose sight of that. And so every time I interact with someone that has to do with one of my cases, whether it's the agents or the witnesses or the defendant, I recognize that I am playing a very important role and probably one of the most important times in this person's life. And that is a huge honor and privilege, because how I do it could deeply affect not just the person sitting in front of me, but their families and their communities, and it can have ramifications far beyond what I can see. And that's incredibly humbling. And that's why, you do have to have the right mindset to be in this job, because you are not going in to ever be thanked. Most people, once they're done with the case, whether it's they're a witness or they've been, convicted, if they're a defendant, they're not going to write you, years from now and be like, I remember you from this. For the most part, they never want to relive this chapter of their life, and that's okay. And so there's not outside validation except a job done right, when I know that I have, vindicated this victim's rights, or a very dangerous person can no longer continue to do the horrendous things that they have done for a very long time before they were able to be stopped with this prosecution, that sort of thing. And so, like Brett said, it really is an incredibly fulfilling duty, because you are not doing it on behalf of yourself. You really are doing it on behalf of the public.
Right. That reminds me actually of a story that I was recently involved with. During the pandemic, we had a friend who was out in, let's say, Appalachia, and they were living in a house, and it was a woman with her girlfriend. They were living in a house together, and my friend had no idea that her girlfriend and her girlfriend's family was running this giant meth operation. They apparently had meth in the ceiling and other places like that. A state and federal task force raided the house, arrested everyone in there. My vibe from the beginning of it was that they really viewed her as a witness. But even though like all the signs pointed to her being a witness, it was nerve wracking. It was anxiety producing. Her life froze completely. And it was a very difficult process until the moment. So the federal prosecutor became more involved in the case, and they sat down and they had a session with her where they were interviewing her, and she was being as cooperative as possible. And as she was walking, and this was the most important moment for her, as her interview was done and she was walking outside, the prosecutor turned to her and said, "We don't think you did anything." And that made the complete difference. We were able to help her then buy a house, get her life started. She went and got a job, and she wasn't getting a job, going out and getting a job, because she was just afraid of like, what's the point? She worked in childcare, of me bonding with these kids, and then all of a sudden I'm going to get taken away to go. And it was just that those short, brief words from the prosecutor. And, she ended up being a witness, but it was the biggest thing in her life, and it was derailing her life until that moment.
Absolutely. And, we always talk about bedside manner for doctors, but I think it's incredibly important to have good, bedside manner as an attorney and as a prosecutor. Just because you're a prosecutor doesn't mean you're a monster. You may be the one, that others view as bringing the most stressful situation into their lives, but it doesn't mean that you're not human as well, and you can't recognize the humanness in everyone involved.
From just thinking of your perspective, thinking of a little bit about, the general space, right? You're inhabiting the space of being prosecutors. You're also inhabiting the space of being in true crime, and true crime itself, right, has been taking a lot of criticism lately, with lots of debates about, the ethics, whether it should be victim centered. There are lots of battles between, should it be journalistic? Should it be an opinion based? And you were kind of alluding at this idea, I think you both were, that a lot of things have sort of led to, I think about the case at the University of Idaho where the 4 college roommates were killed, or I think of some other cases. It can lead to some prejudgment and other challenges. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are from your perspective about, how the true crime space can add value and where it can sort of be unhelpful, and if there's a roadmap for that.
Well, I mean, I think it's funny that people act like the media did not sensationalize crime before true crime came along. Like as if it's true crime podcasters who are sitting outside of the house in Idaho, recording, right? And not, certain famous people who will remain unnamed who are involved in the mainstream media, right?
Who sit at tables in front of the house, maybe.
Yeah, and look, I really don't like the ethics and true crime conversation because, number one, I don't like when people try and tell other people what to listen to or what to watch. It just gives me the heebie-jeebies. I just don't like it. And the other thing is, I feel like it ignores the fact that, to me, for instance, we talk a lot about how the focus of so much media when it comes to crime, if you're a young, pretty white girl who goes missing, there's going to be all sorts of focus on you, right? And that is a criticism that people often have of media coverage in general. To me, that's a mainstream media problem. If you want to see people who are covering, missing and murdered Indigenous women, or people of color, or sex workers. I mean, if you want to see people who are covering those cases and are digging into them and trying to get justice for them, you're much more likely to see that in a true crime podcast with 2 ladies drinking wine than you are on CNN. And that's just a fact. So are there sort of, people who do things that aren't ethical? Yes, absolutely. We see it all the time. And a lot of times the reaction of the true crime community to those people is very negative. There was an example just recently of a lady who, for whatever reason, decided it was a good idea to get some autopsy photos of a child who'd been murdered and put those on her YouTube page behind a paywall. And the reaction was outrage. And it was outrage from the members of the true crime community. So to me, I think a lot of this is, number one, misguided, misdirected, and overblown. I think there is sort of a natural ethic in true crime. And I think that the vast majority of people who are doing true crime stuff care deeply about victims, and more than anything want to help victims. I mean, look at Delphi and the community support of the family in Delphi. I mean, I think true crime a lot of times is doing a great job of doing exactly that, focusing on victims, trying to focus on justice, and trying to avoid some of the sensationalism that you often see, frankly, in mainstream media.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, from the very beginning, the judicial system was meant to be open to the public, right? It's when things happen under, the dark of night is when things go wrong. And so we always envisioned that courtrooms were supposed to be open, that anyone could sit in. You can go into any courtroom unless it's sealed. And usually it's a high bar to be sealed. The default is for courtrooms to be open, whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, for the public to see what their judiciary is doing. It's one of the three branches of government. And, I think there's always been a natural draw to understand how one of us, right? It's a human question of how we are capable of doing things that should be the unthinkable. And I think it's a very important question because it's understanding our humanity. It's, the existential question. And kind of like Brett said, everyone kind of approaches it maybe slightly differently, but that's partly why I'm not surprised at all that there is an interest in the true crime space. And it's not also something that just happened in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I mean, this is a tale as old as time. And more often than not, we will have many of our listeners write to us about a case that is near and dear to their heart because it's a family member, because it's someone they knew, asking for us to cover or someone else to cover so that their case, which is one of unfortunately many, 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 can get the light of day, so that someone can care about it and listen about it. And, there are just too many cases for, say, one jurisdiction to be able to, investigate all of them. And sometimes it is the attention of those loved ones who keep it top of mind and bring the attention that is needed to be able to fully investigate that case and hopefully lead to a successful prosecution if that's the direction that it takes.
That reminds me of the episode you guys did. I think this is very, very early on, probably in your first year. Darlie Routier. Yeah, that was I forget what state that was in, but it was somewhere in New England, and she was driving her car erratically, and I think her son's...
Diane.
Okay, Diane.
Yeah, Darlie Routier is a mom in Texas.
Yeah. Okay, mom in Texas, right. Diane. What was her last name? Diane
Schuler. Diane
Schuler. Diane Schuler. It made me... I remember when I listened to that episode, just thinking about how tragic that was. And I kind of stopped myself in the middle of it thinking, like, why am I interested in this? Like, why am I interested in these true crime stories? And I spent a couple moments thinking about it, and I realized it's exactly what you were saying, Alice. It's that I think we have a deep need to understand how, both the victim and the person who does something wrong end up on this collision course. It helps us understand the world around us. And I think, it gives us something of real value. And I know there is sensationalism, there are ethical issues, but I think it's sort of like a philosophical or fundamental need is behind all of that. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, the biggest thing we heard during the Alec Murdaugh trial when we covered it was, I cannot get over the fact that a father, a seemingly loving father, could kill his own son, right? Because that is kind of one of those laws of nature that a parent should only love and protect their offspring. But how can it be that we exist in a world where it is possible for all external signs to point to everything is fine, for that father to be able to kill his own offspring in just cold blood, right? That is a question I think that shook people to their very cores, because all of us know parents, our parents have parents. And it's kind of the basis of how we understand all relationships around us. And to have that core relationship in your life that orders your entire universe be shaken is essentially an existential crisis. And I partly think that's why so many people were so drawn to that case, and why we got so many messages along those lines of, I don't want to live in a world where a father can do that to their own child. But that is a world that we live in. And for the most part, we suspend the knowledge that that kind of world exists because we can't go about our lives knowing all the chaos that can exist around us, right? That's just how our brains work. We kind of suspend a lot of the chaos to fully exist in the world that we are, because we just don't have the capacity to process all the chaos. But when one of these cases kind of thrusts in front of you where you cannot ignore the chaos, where you cannot suspend, that sort of chaos in your life, and you have to deal with it face on, it's almost as if you're having to deal with it yourself, even though you're processing a very important question through someone else's case.
I remember something both of you said about the Alec Murdaugh case that struck me. In one of your episodes, you said you both believed he loved his son. And I thought that was just a really kind of interesting and different take, in the sense that you believed at the same time he probably did it, right? He's the guy.
Yeah.
But yes, he can also love his son. And that's a kind of cognitive dissonance. I guess maybe you guys as prosecutors, it's not cognitive dissonance for you all, but for the rest of us, it can be a little hard to understand how those two things, because it's easy for the rest of us, right? The bad guy's a monster, right? The victim is perfect, right? And we know those things are rarely true, I guess.
And I think both of those things are worth disabusing people of. And we talk about this sometimes in our episodes. Like, we'll talk about the things about the victim, the victimology, the things that were going on in their lives that put them in a situation where a monster, well, not a monster, but someone could take advantage of them. And there is what I think is a good thing in true crime, a focus on not victim blaming. And I think that's important, but you can take that too far when it is every victim lights up the room, and you almost turn it into those are the victims that we really care about, right? Mm-hmm. Not the ones who have, like all of us do, flaws and faults that are problems but don't justify whatever happened to us. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the monster. Are there monsters out there? Yes. I mean, I think there absolutely are. And I think you see cases of those, but I think they're pretty rare. I think the average person who's involved in crime, even really horrible ones, unfortunately, and this can be scary, is just like you or me. And there is just something in their life that, for whatever reason, leads them to do the thing they did. Alec Murdaugh is a great example of that. I think a lot of people want to believe you could only do something like that out of hate. Like he must have hated his wife and hated his son to do that. And I think when you look at the facts of the case, you'll realize, no, that's not true. His justification that he gave to himself is a warped one, and it's one that from the outside is so obviously wrong that you can recognize that. But as I've said before, in most people's mind, most criminals' minds, everything they do makes sense. It's all rational to them. In the world that they are living in, this is a rational decision they're making, even if it's a hard decision. And, we went through in a lot of episodes on that, what we think led him to that place where that was the rational thing for him to do, was murder his wife and his child. But I think in that moment, he thought that was his only choice. And I think part of him even thought he was doing them a favor in some ways.
Right.
And that's a warped thing, but I think it's reality. And yeah, I think reminding people of that's important, because it's not just about, telling the story, but it's also in your own life. I mean, you can see, and we have listeners who reach out to us and say this kind of stuff all the time. Sometimes you can see in your own life some of the things that went on in these cases, and it can be a warning sign for you and sort of a wake up call. And that's a scary thought, but just, there are a lot of people out there who were true crime fans before they became true crime victims, and I think that is an important part. But let me also say this. I think justice for victims is important. I think educating people is important. I think having a better understanding is important. But I think something you said is very true. True crime is deeply human, and it is, as Alice said, as old as time. And we don't shy away from the fact this is entertainment, and it is entertaining, and people enjoy it in the same way they enjoy horror movies or murder mysteries, right? They enjoy the mystery of it. They enjoy unraveling a mystery, figuring things out, sort of, putting the pieces together, looking at the evidence, lining things up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And we always tell people that, like, don't be ashamed of the fact that you enjoy true crime, because it is so human. And you can say you shouldn't all day long, but it is in human nature to be fascinated by some of this sort of like the worst of humanity. And it has always been that way. And it's not just true crime that sort of shows you that.
Right. From Elizabeth Bathory to Jack the Ripper to anything today, we've always been fascinated about it. That reminds me of something else that you guys mentioned. I obviously don't have access to your inbox. So, one of the things that I find nice about your podcast is, when the absurd thing happens or when, something ridiculous, you guys are able to like laugh at it and make it jovial and make it light, which is a kind of interesting thing, because I run into a lot of podcasts, true crime podcasts, that are just absolutely serious about everything. But did you guys intentionally decide to take that approach? Is it just naturally your personalities? Come on.
You can't put Alice and I on anything and it's not laugh.
I think part of it is it's, Brett and I have seen probably the darkest of humanity you can ever imagine. I still sometimes like categorize it away, and I can't believe that I have seen some of the darkest things I will ever see in life. And we've seen real darkness, right? And bad reviews and people not liking our music is not the darkest of life. And so we're not pretending to laugh about it. It's really like, wow, we have seen like as dark when you think that there can be nothing darker in life. And this is not it. And you know what? I am going to enjoy the joyful things in life because there is light. Thank goodness the dark is not the end, right? The morning always comes. And part of, being able to persist in this job, but by this job, I mean podcasting and also being a lawyer in general, is to be able to recognize the difference between real darkness and everything else that, you know what, if you don't laugh, then what's the point? And so truly, I think Brett and I we just have a lot of fun with each other, and it's easier to laugh when you have a friend to laugh with. But I think it's a good reminder that not everything has to be taken super seriously. We can take our job seriously, and we can take the stories that we tell seriously, and we can take victims seriously. But the fact that maybe interspersed in those conversations, we are able to laugh at the things that we can laugh about, because there's so much in life and so much in true crime that is not funny whatsoever, then take those moments. And that does not in any way diminish the seriousness of what we are discussing. In fact, I think it shows the good balance that everyone must have in how they view their life, not just in, say, true crime, or not just in your life.
Right. And it's probably worth saying, never heard you guys laugh when it comes to a victim or a crime. Usually it's about someone's absurd theory of the crime that you're getting a good chuckle out of. So that it's less intentional than it's just your natural personalities. Is that fair, Brett?
I mean, I think that's absolutely fair. And that's the way we've always approached the show. I mean, we're just being ourselves. There is no, we're not playing characters on this show. And as Alice said, we can be talking about really dark subject matter. I don't think that means you have to be morose the whole time that you're talking about it. As you said, like, we're not laughing at terrible things that happen to people, and we're not laughing at victims. But there are absurd things in cases, number one. And number two, Alice and I do things, we mess up and we do things that are funny, and we're going to laugh at that. It's like, I remember one time there was a case, and at the beginning I said, I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. And somebody in a comment was like, I can't believe you would say people are going to enjoy a case about murder. And I responded, why are you listening to this if you don't enjoy it? Like, if you're not enjoying listening to this, you need to stop because it's not bringing you joy and life is too short to be miserable all the time. And that's sort of our approach to it. Like, we are approaching these cases seriously and we put a lot of effort into them and we want to be respectful, but our personalities are going to come through and we're not going to just, sound like we're miserable the whole time that we're talking about dark subjects.
Yeah. And people probably wouldn't be listening if you sounded miserable all the time, which actually brings me to another point. I was going to ask you about your process and just throw out an example for me. So I had read a bunch of stories, I was not obsessed with this case at all, but I had read a couple stories on the case of Murray, who was a young college student, I think at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, who went missing in Vermont. And there's a lot of weirdness and rabbit holes and other stuff around that case. But I had read some mainstream news articles on that. It was interesting to me, but I was not one of those people who fell over for it. But when I listened to your episodes, I think it was 4 or 5 episodes on it. It was the first time I really understood how, I guess, weird the case was and why it attracted so many people to it. So I was going to ask just a little bit about what is your process for telling stories? Because I know on Legal Briefs, you guys often, the second podcast, you interview people. On your main podcast, you're often telling your listeners a story. What is the process of sort of like pulling that together, the writing, the research, and how you tell the stories?
Well, Maura Murray is probably not a great example just because I've been obsessed with that case for so long. So I basically was like, Alice, this is what we're doing. But, I think one of the advantages we have, and Alice talks about this a lot, so I don't want to steal all her thunder, is lawyers have to be good storytellers, particularly if you're a litigator. If you're going to stand up in front of really a judge, a jury, whatever, and put facts together in a convincing way, in a way that's engaging, you have to be a good storyteller. So I think some of that comes through in the show, but we have a structure that we've used since the first episode and we always use it. And it starts with a timeline. I think Alice and I both agree it's just the most important thing. And I will say this, we stick to that timeline, even though there are cases where the timeline ruins the mystery. And sometimes if you listen to other podcasts, and I'm not being critical of them, but if you listen to other podcasts, they will obscure the timeline until sort of the end, because they know once they sort of lay everything out and you see it, you'll be like, oh, okay, I see exactly what the thing is. So usually the way we do it is we do the timeline. We don't try and hide the ball. We give you a timeline, and then we sort of back up and go through sort of the big pieces of evidence. And then we like to give a conclusion. And this bothers some people, which I don't really understand, but we always like to give a theory. We like to give the theories that are out there, but then we also like to say, hey, this is what we think happened. And I think people have gravitated to that. And I think one of the reasons is just, I think that's a good way to tell a story, sort of orient people to time and place, and then sort of slowly give them the details and build up to what you think the answer is. So they know the mystery by the end, and they're having in their own mind, they're starting to form their own opinions. They're starting to have their own ideas. And, I think at the end, when you give them your opinion, it's really edifying for them, because either they're like, yes, I was right all along, they agree with me, or they can be like, no, that's crazy, you're completely wrong, here's all the reasons why. And I think it works out pretty well to get people engaged in the storytelling.
Have you guys ever disagreed on the case? Wait, Maura Murray. Yes, that is one.
So, people ask us that a lot. And part of it is that unlike the soundbite world of, social media today, we don't arrive at our conclusions with okay, on the count of 3, say yes or no. 1, 2, 3. Absolutely not. The reason, we're so long-winded and the reason that we have multi-part episodes is because it takes hours and hours of us talking with each other as we refine kind of where we're getting with our conclusion, with our theories. We don't share our theories with each other ahead of time, ever, right? We read primary sources, we read trial transcripts, we try to consume all there is firsthand from the cases, not just relying on what other people have covered, because you're going to cover it with, your viewpoint. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there's also a very important, research tactic, which everyone should know and learn in school, is to go to the primary sources. And from those sources, kind of create your impressions of it. And Brett and I talking on the podcast, that's really us, right? That's how we actually do our real cases in real life as well. It is a back and forth. You build a timeline. You ask questions about things that stick out that don't seem to be rational. Why would this happen? Why would anyone do something like that? We talk about Occam's razor a lot because Occam's razor is real life as well. If we have a real case in front of us, these are the questions we'd be asking. And so the reason our conclusions are often pretty close to each other is because we've actually spent 5, 6, 7 hours, depends how many episodes you have on a particular case, kind of refining and challenging and debating and talking about all the different factors that are going into the case. And it's not that we have to agree with each other. It's that it's so much more nuanced than a yes or no answer. And we've spent so much time pouring through the records and pouring through the different aspects and hearing, I may have a point of view, but as Brett's asking questions, he's bringing up things that I never thought about before. And it's forcing me to kind of pivot and look at it from a different viewpoint. And we are doing that continuously until the very end. And so that's why I think a lot of our listeners end up agreeing with us. I don't think it's necessarily because we get it right all the time. I think a lot of it is that they're along for the discussion and they at least understand where we're coming from. They may disagree with the ultimate theory, but we're not hiding the ball at all on how we're thinking. I want to explain to you why I've reached the conclusion that I have. And that is something that's really missing from just general discussion and dialogue writ large, not just in true crime, but like in our society today. And by walking people through our thinking process, I think people begin to at least understand where we're coming from. And then they can ask really good questions that challenge our conclusions because they know exactly what went into that conclusion.
It's kind of a model for maybe the way that we should be having broader discussions about issues in general. And it's also interesting. I never really thought about it from the perspective of the way that you guys do the podcast itself is exactly the way you would need to examine or explore a case. You've got to come to some conclusion or with all those caveats, right? Like about what's missing or
we do though. You either close out an investigation and don't bring charges, or you move forward with charges, right? So you're right about that. And, the reason it comes off so easily, recently we've been doing more live recordings and then we get off topic because we just get so excited seeing so many people and want to answer their chats. But when we record, we press record, and what you hear on the podcast is basically everything we record, right? We're not really, we edit out, maybe where we stumbled on words, but we're not like trying to splice together some brilliant argument. What you hear on the podcast is how we are talking and the flow of how we are talking to each other, because that's actually how we talk in our legal professions as well.
That's kind of one of the things I was going to ask you. I was sort of thinking about that model and that approach. So that is something you would normally do if you're working on a case together. You bounce it off each other. You do your research. I'm just curious, what is the day-to-day sort of life of a trial, a criminal trial attorney or an appellate attorney doing that kind of work? Because I know you've done both. Because I think a lot of us probably have a lot of misconceptions about what you all do on a daily basis.
Well, I think some of it depends on exactly what you're doing, and some of it depends on exactly what kind of case it is. Alice and I, one case we like to talk about was our biggest case that we worked on together. Ended up in a month-long trial and like a 2-year-long investigation. And that one was much more sort of what you think of and maybe even what you see on television, where the investigation's ongoing. We're working with our agents, figuring out things, going through documents, talking to witnesses, trying to put together what happened and when it happened and how it happened, and eventually moving to a point where we could put together an indictment and figuring out who the bad guys were and who the sort of innocent bystanders, like your friend, for instance. She's sucked into this, but she's not really part of it. Figuring out who those people are, removing those people, and then going forward with the indictment, eventually going to trial and doing it. That, I think, is in most people's minds the way it works. In reality, usually with a lot of cases, It's much more sort of, there's an investigation, and at some point someone comes to you and says, hey, I've got this case. Here's basically what's going on. Here's what we think. Here's everything we have. Take a look at this. Tell us what else you need. And then you get a file and you're going through it and you're looking at the evidence, and maybe you're listening to some recordings, or you're reading witness interviews and all that kind of stuff. And then you're going back to them and saying, hey, I think we got this kind of case, but you're missing these pieces. Let's see if we can figure that out. And you're sort of working to build the case and fill in the holes with that, that case, to move it to a point where you can actually take it to trial. If you do appellate work, I do a lot of appellate work. That's sort of, it can be frustrating because a lot of the mistakes, if they've been made, they've already been made, right? And so you get the file and you see the problems, and then you're having to figure out, is this something we can overcome? Is this something that maybe the law needs to change? Is it something where this is a fundamental mistake and we need to just confess error, which is something you can do as well. Going back to that whole notion of, as a prosecutor, you're always supposed to be looking for justice, to do the right thing. One of the reasons I like appellate work is I like that sort of, it's almost kind of like true crime, where you get the file and you're digging into it and diving into it and figuring out exactly what happened and maybe where things did go wrong, and then figuring out the argument you're going to make. That's sort of,
it's like its own investigation, right? And it's more of, I guess, that the appellate level, it's maybe less about, hey, you once said this quote, and I don't know where or how I heard it, and I'm not going to get it right, but it was something like, the trial court is the place, where it's about the humans, where, you care about the people, and that at the appellate level, it's about the facts of the case. It's much more about the law and the philosophy, and I can see how you would gravitate to both the human, the psychology of it. Despite what you say, you're an excellent behavioral analyst. No, really. I mean, it's part of the attraction, but also philosophical too, right? That's a piece of who you are. It reminds me. So one of the things that I'm absolutely curious about is the vulnerability you guys show. Before I had ever had a conversation with you or talked with you guys online, I knew about your son, Brett, when he was in the NICU. Alice, I knew, some of the struggles of your immigrant parents. I even knew about, the farm that you grew up on in Atlanta beside Roswell High School. I used to drive by that as a middle schooler. I was like, I grew up my middle school days were in Marietta. So,
amazing.
So, but I knew so much, and you guys, it's something I don't see in general, not just in the space of podcasting, but people who are in public facing positions sharing so much of their lives and sharing such, intimate and things that a lot of people hide or could be deeply painful. Is that just you guys being you, or is there, I think for me, it made you guys so much more human.
Yeah, I mean, we're not we truly are not putting on an act. That is just us. But I think it's so important that so many people are choosing to allow us into their lives. Everyone has limited time. You can listen to a million podcasts. And, even though we may not be able to see each other, the fact that you're listening to my thoughts, my opinions, I think it warrants you understanding where that viewpoint was formed. Right? People laugh about, oh my goodness, you talk about your kids so much. But truly, I'm learning more about the law and how I relate to what I do in the law and my role in kind of the judicial system by being a parent. It's because it's where I am in my life right now, right? We take lessons wherever we are in life. And by sharing where we were formed and how we were formed, I think can help people understand where our viewpoints come from. And also, here's the thing, the human experience can be incredibly lonely until you realize that there are so many more commonalities than there are things that divide us, right? I mean, Brett and I, just looking at us on the outside and knowing our backgrounds, we probably couldn't be two more different people. He is like my best friend. And if we chose to only put ourselves into, boxes that divided us, then we would miss out on a beautiful friendship, a beautiful work relationship, and this amazing podcast experience that, is truly been a highlight for both of us in our lives. And so I think there's nothing that you really can lose by being vulnerable. I have learned that even in the courtroom. A lot of people think that by hiding your vulnerability, you show strength, but I think it's the opposite. By showing vulnerability, you are choosing to take the first step to extend out and to reach out into the void and say like, hey, life is hard. Let's go through this together.
Come back and join the three of us again next week, where we're going to talk more about their backgrounds and their histories, the things that made them who they are, the community that's been built around their podcast, on being vulnerable, and some of the value that comes from open debate, some of the challenges that exist in true crime podcasting, and what matters most to them. This is Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast.